So, I've been wanting to tackle this topic for a while now. It's one of my favourite subplots in Bleach, but it's also a tricky one. It's admittedly messy, it's convoluted, and it spans almost all of the biggest arcs of the series. Of course, what I'm talking about here are Aizen's sinister Hollowfication experiments, his shadowy quest to go further beyond what any normal Shinigami can achieve. I was actually inspired to get this done after watching the recent Everything But the Rain episodes of the 1000-Year Blood War anime. It just rekindled how awesome all of this stuff actually is that's going on mostly behind the scenes. But like I said, it's a little all over the place. I feel Kubo buckling under the weight of what he's created somewhat with this one. The timeline is a little unclear. So, join me in this video as I try my best to really put this plotline into perspective, because like I said, it's a great one and it truly deserves it. I'm going to attempt to create a chronological timeline of Aizen's machinations, from the earliest point we see to the last, while giving you my best explanation of what he was doing along the way as I can. We could even consider this a sequel to my video on the Hogyoku, as you better believe that ball of mystery is going to be showing up here again. I can't promise concrete answers, but I'm here to bring you, at the very least, my best and most thorough interpretation. Before we get on with the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support for me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And as always, I want to give a massive shout out to everyone supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate your support. It means the world to me, so thank you all very much. And you know what? I thought I might have to throw up a spoiler warning here, but I'm actually pretty sure the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime has now covered everything we will be talking about in this video, but just in case, here's a spoiler warning for the 1000-Year Blood War arc nonetheless. So, for just over half the lifespan of the series, our main antagonist was Sosuke Aizen, at one point the captain of the 5th Division turned traitor who waged war against the Soul Society. He had two villainous goals that he wanted to achieve during his tenure as our big bad. His first ambition was to gain entry to the mythical royal realm and kill the Soul King, thereby sitting upon the throne of heaven himself. This was of course the catalyst for the entire conflict of effectively the second half of the Arrancar arc. However, it's his second goal that we're focusing on today. Compared to that grandiose, almost supervillain master plan, this one is a lot more subdued and takes place almost entirely in the shadows. It's here we get an Aizen who is less of a man fixated on becoming a god, and more of a curious, albeit unethical, scientist. That second goal was to discover a way of becoming a transcendent being, someone who shattered the boundaries of Shinigami and Hollow to become something more, and Aizen originally believed he would achieve this through a method known as Hollowfication, something he studied extensively. So, briefly, what exactly is this idea known as Hollowfication? It's a concept that features extensively in the Arrancar arc, but is also mentioned in both the Soul Society and 1000-Year Blood War arcs. Basically, the crux of this idea was the theory that it might be possible to strengthen the Konpaku, that's the spiritual body, of a Shinigami by fusing it with the soul of a Hollow, but the process is dangerous and experimental and was never perfected. Hollowfication involves the injection of a hollow soul into the soul of another being, traditionally here a Shinigami, forcibly breaking down the border between the two souls. Once those souls then merge, that being should theoretically evolve into a soul of a higher level. The Soul Society itself commissioned research into this idea, and why wouldn't it? The Gotei 13 is a military organisation, and any means they might have of strengthening their own soldiers is worth looking into. However, they quickly found that controlling this process was beyond them. And so begins my attempt at a chronological look at Aizen's own Hollowfication experiments timeline. I believe the earliest point we get to see him conducting any kind of Hollowfication related experiments comes in chapter 415. In secret, apparently before he was even a vice captain, Aizen had already come to the conclusion that a Hogyoku was what was necessary to attain true Hollowfication. This moment where Gin is seen spying on Aizen through the bushes appears to be the earliest point I can find anyway of Aizen conducting any kind of experimentation of this nature. Here we see several of Aizen's goons reporting to him. One of them holds up a piece of somebody's own soul that these men have stolen. Aizen takes that portion of a soul and drops it into a small flask, which contains the earliest known appearance of a Hogyoku, at least in terms of the timeline. And we know that this soul portion came from none other than Rangiku Matsumoto, and so we can see here too that it's possible to shave away a part of someone's soul while they're alive and keep them alive as well, as of course Matsumoto is still alive even now in the present day in the story. Now, according to the light novel Can't Fear Your Own World, what was actually extracted from Rangiku here was supposedly one of the Soul King's nails, but the source material has only ever stated that souls were being used in the creation of the Hogyoku, and to be honest, I think it's of little consequence either way. And for this specific timeline, the vast majority, if not almost absolutely everything we need to know, appears within that source material. It's difficult to know for sure how many years we then progress along the timeline from this point to our next point, but I would presume it's at least a decade. We know it can't be too long after that moment that Gin decides to join the Gotei 13 and eventually meet up with Aizen, taking us to Turn Back the Pendulum, and from that point we then skip ahead another 9 years, so I'm guessing it's about a decade. This takes us to chapter -104, Turn Back the Pendulum 5. We see that 9 years after Urahara has been made captain, Aizen is conducting experiments on Rukongai district residents. Whether these men volunteered or were forced into these experiments is unknown, but Aizen somehow injects a hollow soul into these 3 men. All of their bodies are completely destroyed upon Hollowfication. As we learn later on, at the very least, a Shinigami soul is needed for some form of balance, so it makes sense that a regular Rukongai citizen wouldn't be able to survive the process, and instead their body commits soul suicide immediately. And so Aizen decides to progress the experiments along to Shinigami victims instead. Upon hearing about these strange deaths in the Rukongai district, the investigations unit of the 9th Division led by Kensei and Mashiro discovered 10 Shinigami uniforms. Aizen has now begun experimenting on Shinigami too, but apparently to no avail, as we can work out from this revelation that basically the same exact thing that happened, the same fate that befell those Rukon citizens, has also befallen these 10 Shinigami. And so it's clear that at this point, perhaps frustrated with their lack of progress, that Aizen and his cohorts decide to up the ante and try and infect captain-level Shinigami. Now at this point, it is difficult to know exactly how their Hollowfication virus is spreading, as it affects certain people, but never affects Aizen nor his men, despite them all being in the vicinity at the same time. One of my theories is that it's being passed via swords somehow. When Kensei is stabbed through the back, that could be him becoming infected. It is also possible that Aizen is using his early Hogyoku, which, like I mentioned, we saw him creating at the start of this timeline, to achieve this, but considering the next time he mentions this Hogyoku of his own, he claims it's a failure that's not working at all, I'm not so sure. It could be as simple as once Kensei was infected, other people simply coming into contact with him meant they would be infected as well, but more on that later. Either way, in chapter -102, Turn Back the Pendulum 7, we see that Aizen and his gang have their first success on their hands. Kensei has successfully hollowified. He's retained his human shape, but the downside is he's become a mindless, albeit extremely powerful monster, now wearing a perfectly formed hollow mask. Urahara would later explain to us in Everything But the Rain that this form we're seeing right here is the result of Kensei's own Shinigami soul and the hollows mingling together, and that a breakdown is currently occurring inside of him. Now, what's really weird here is that Hiyori begins coughing while she's being held by Shinji, implying that she's already been infected by whatever this virus is. So, going back to that earlier point I made, was she infected simply by coming into contact with Kensei, as he's certainly not using a sword anymore? We've seen that Hollow Reiatsu is spread like a disease many times, so I suppose it is possible, meaning that everybody here is basically doomed from the moment they engage in this battle. Anyway, in -101, Turn Back the Pendulum 8, a hollow-fied Mashiro arrives, also a mindless monster. In chapter -100, Turn Back the Pendulum 9, Hiyori suddenly hollow-fies in Shinji's arms. The Hollow Reiatsu pours out of her mouth. She seems to know that something bad is about to happen, and it forms a mask immediately on her face. It is slightly strange that Kensei has hollow-like appendages now bursting out of his body, and Mashiro seems to have hollow armor on her legs, but Hiyori only gets the perfectly formed mask. But I mean, I presume an easy explanation for that is simply because these other two have been under the hollow influence longer than she has, and if left unchecked, she would have gone the same way. However, Tozen arrives and cuts everybody else down. And then in chapter -99, Turn Back the Pendulum 10, we see that Shinji begins to undergo Hollowfication too, perhaps because of his engagement with Hiyori. His Hollowfication is sped up rapidly by the fact that he is enraged, something Aizen confirms to us, which is why we see the Hollow Reiatsu quickly descend down his torso, giving him the appearance of armor that Hiyori doesn't yet have. The other Shinigami all begin to hollowfy too, presumably due to coming into contact with the other victims. What's weird about this is if that is all that's needed to hollowfy someone in this moment, why doesn't Tosen hollowfy when he cuts down Hiyori? Of course, it's possible that Aizen has devised some kind of antidote, but that seems highly unlikely considering how experimental this has all been, and how on the fly Aizen seems to be running these tests. It's interesting as well that Hiyori seems to be able to fight off her hollowfication momentarily before Tosen cuts her down. I imagine that is through sheer force of will, as Shinji is also pretty successfully, for the most part, fighting off this transformation while confronting Aizen. But as Aizen prepares to kill them all, citing them as little more than pawns in his ongoing experiments, presumably this knight has confirmed to him that Hollowfication is possible with a strong enough Shinigami soul, as well as another little detail which we'll get into a little bit later on regarding the Hogyoku and its potential. Kisuke arrives to try and apprehend him. In chapter -98, Turn Back the Pendulum 11, Kisuke confirms to Aizen that he knows what Hollowfication is. This is interesting to me, as Aizen's response seems to imply that Hollowfication is either very unknown at the moment, or at least not practiced at all. So there's two possible answers here. Either Soul Society didn't begin attempting to hollowfy Shinigami to bolster their strength until after this incident, which is very possible, or the unit that was in charge of that testing, which included Kisuke presumably, was kept top secret. I think both answers are totally possible. And to be honest, the second one, the latter, is maybe more possible because Kisuke even later says that he himself was researching methods of improving the strength of a Shinigami's Konpaku. And when in Everything But the Rain, he reveals that the Soul Society itself was looking into that, it's hard not to put two and two together and presume he was doing some kind of research for them, but it's never actually confirmed either way. In fact, in this same chapter, Kisuke mentions that he was researching ways of strengthening the Shinigami, and the idea of Hollowfication was something he stumbled upon while doing so. So it's possible he introduced the very idea of Hollowfication as a potential method to the Gotei 13 itself. While trying to find a way to achieve this Hollowfication state, Kisuke created something that could, he thought, destroy those barriers immediately. The Hogyoku. Now, despite having done that entire video on the Hogyoku, its existence is still such a mystery. How does it actually work? How does one use it? Does Kisuke momentarily fuse it with each Shinigami to try and save their lives, or does simply having it in their vicinity work, as we saw with Chad and Orihime? I mean, there are just so many questions still pertaining to the Hogyoku, answers of which would really help us out here, I think. How does taking what seems to be a little glass ball and stuffing it full of Shinigami and Rukongai citizen souls create something that is sentient that has the ability to grant wishes? I have no idea, and some answers would go a long way. I don't think we'll ever get them, though. It's interesting, and we'll get into this a bit more later on as well, but the answer to these strange phenomena always seems to be multiple Shinigami souls. That's how the Hogyoku seems to be brought to life in some way. That's how Asauchi are created. That's how White was created again. This is stuff we'll all get into later on, but it's just weird that composites of Shinigami souls seem to have these extremely strange properties. Anyway, let's move on from that minefield. We know that after unveiling the Hogyoku in Turn Back the Pendulum, Kisuke believed he could use this to save these hollowified Shinigami. And so in chapter -97, Let's Stop the Pendulum, Kisuke awakens to see an unconscious Shinji still wearing a hollow mask. Because of this, Kisuke is disappointed. He believes he has failed to save them. The truth is, he hasn't. He's succeeded, but not in the way he hoped. Basically, Kisuke was hoping to somehow, using the Hogyoku, totally remove and reverse the Hollowfication. My guess here, and this is only speculation, but because Kisuke theorized the Hogyoku could break down the barriers between Shinigami and Hollow, it might be possible to almost reverse engineer that, break down those barriers once again now the souls have become twisted and mingled, and separate them once more. Such a thing, however, is now impossible. It's totally impossible to completely get rid of their Hollowfication. Instead, what Kisuke is currently unaware of, where he has succeeded, is the Hogyoku has helped to stabilize their minds. Although currently comatose, these Shinigami have now all become perfect Vizards, whose minds are intact, as the Hogyoku sensed that's what Kisuke wanted for them. All that's left is to now stabilize their bodies to prevent soul suicide, and considering they are Shinigami Hollow hybrids, that means it's a quote-unquote fairly simple task that can be achieved via a vaccine of Quincy arrows and human souls, as Kisuke would explain to us in Everything But the Rain. Now again, some of that is speculation on my part. I was racking my brain over what difference the Hogyoku actually made when Kisuke later on says that he saved them from soul suicide anyway using a vaccine, implying that was how he stabilized them. The only thing I could come up with was it was the Hogyoku's interference that sealed the deal and saved them from being these mindless monsters, instead turning them back to their normal selves with hollow powers, turning them into perfect Vizards. But while their minds were now safe, their bodies were still vulnerable to being destroyed via soul suicide, so that's where Kisuke had to step in with his vaccine. Anyway, between this point and Everything But the Rain, Aizen would focus his efforts on creating brand new types of hollows with powers very similar to those of Shinigami. It was a rudimentary answer to Hollowfication and the best he could come up with at the time, not a true solution but a success nonetheless. Aizen created, as revealed in chapter 175, hollows with the power to hide their spiritual pressure, something Shinigami can do, and these are revealed to be the same hollows that later attacked Hisagi and the other students, resulting in Hisagi's scarred face, as well as hollows who could actually fuse with Shinigami and destroy Zanpakuto, such as the hollow Metastasia, which killed Kaien. So Aizen is responsible for all of those tragedies that befell numerous Shinigami, but he himself was unsatisfied. He states that none of them could really be considered a brand new type of being. We know that around this time Aizen was concocting these particular experiments. He was now the captain of the 5th Division and Gin was his vice captain. So we can roughly place that in terms of the timeline, and then we have to move forwards again a few years to reach chapter 529, Everything But the Rain 2, The Rudiments, now set 20 years before the main story, where Aizen, Gin and Tosen are all captains. We hear from Hitsugaya that 2 months prior to this moment in the story, some Shinigami were reported dead in Naruki City, and now 2 more have been killed. We later see Aizen and Tosen in their own secret laboratory somewhere within Seirete, so clearly they've upgraded their experiment setup somewhat. They're now trying to locate and root out the missing Vizards who are hiding in the human world, and at the same time, they're also conducting Hollowfication experiments. And finally, Aizen has had what appears to be another breakthrough. He has finally been successful in creating a new being at last. They've created a totally new type of Hollow born from the souls of a Shinigami, which they're calling White, which has the ability to forcibly hollowfy other targets. Unfortunately for them, their plans have stalled somewhat as the poison that White is using to hollowfy others is so strong that even Shinigami targets in the real world are simply dying instead of being hollowfied. So basically, to simplify, Aizen now has a brand new type of hollow that can dispense targeted hollowfication, and they deploy it in the human world every now and then to try and hollowfy Shinigami targets, and presumably they are hoping as well to cause enough of a ruckus to maybe lure out one of the Vizards at the same time. In chapter 532, The White Noise, Aizen believes this prototype hollow of theirs is a failure if it can't defeat even a captain in Shikai, but Tosen claims it's on a wholly different level to the hollows they've created so far, as it was built on the foundation of numerous Shinigami souls, rather than simply being a modified hollow soul like they were working on between Turn Back the Pendulum and this point in time. So again, to just try and simplify a little bit, Aizen and his gang have graduated from simply creating essentially regular hollows with weird special powers to creating a brand new type of creature, an actual hybrid of Hollow and Shinigami souls that can act and move independently, and even according to Isshin, fights in a way that's more reminiscent of a Shinigami. Anyway, White would later choose Masaki Kurosaki as its target for Hollowfication as a result of her in that moment being a perfect opposite of it. At the time, she was a human Quincy, where White was a Hollow Shinigami. In chapter 533, Masaki kills White, shattering his body and causing the mass within its center to rapidly expand. My theory on this is that the mass that's been stuffed into White's hollow hole is the crude amalgamation of Shinigami souls that would act as White's core. It's his literal core, and White himself was kind of built around it. That's why we can see these strange lumpy masses permeating in stasis in tubes inside Aizen's laboratory. Presumably they are more soul masses just waiting to be used within the creation of a new being. Anyway, when White finally chose a target to hollowfy, Masaki, he initiated his final phase, that of soul transfer, essentially finally transferring his own hollow essence into somebody else. So a self-destruct contingency was initiated and his body was destroyed, perhaps to cover up his existence. My assumption here is that Aizen and Tosen effectively made it so that White would be destroyed the moment he achieved his goal. It's difficult to say for sure. A part of me still wonders if this is White's soul undergoing soul suicide now his structural integrity has been reduced to basically nothing. My reasoning for thinking that is because Tosen seems to be very shocked that he's exploding at all, but I do think it might just be something they have initiated, they put inside the soul mass to basically cover their tracks and to hide any evidence of their experiments once they had finally progressed to that next stage. However, because White chose a Quincy, which can't survive hollowfication, a Quincy is not ever supposed to be hollowfied, they have no natural resistances to that Reiatsu, so upon doing that, Aizen and Tosen have no reason to believe that Masaki would ever survive that moment. Tosen thinks their efforts have been completely for nothing. They designed White to hollowfy other Shinigami and keep the progression of their experiments going. But as far as they're concerned, it ends here. Masaki will die because there's no way to save her Quincy from Hollowfication. So as far as Tosen's concerned, it was all a waste of time and resources, but Aizen remains cautiously optimistic. And of course, as we know, in 540, Oetsu Nimaya would reveal the manner of White's creation, the layering and mixing of many Shinigami souls that have presumably all perished by this point, as, like I said before in one of my reviews, I don't think Oetsu's going out killing people, is the same as how he creates a Asauchi, meaning White kept the same properties as an Asauchi despite being a Hollow. Because of this, it was able to enter Ichigo's own soul and fuse with his powers, becoming, of course, his latent Zanpakuto. But we've gone off course a little bit, so let's return to Aizen's experiment timeline. In chapter 416, we see Aizen, now a captain, going through Kisuke's research on Hollowfication. Although Aizen has had his own Hogyoku for a while now, as we saw at the very start of this timeline, it is considered a total failure. No matter how many souls he feeds it, again, as we saw earlier on, it will never be complete and presumably never actually awaken. Aizen decides as he goes through Kisuke's research that he needs to steal Kisuke's own Hogyoku that he created and hid away. Although Kisuke's own Hogyoku is also incomplete, it's presumably awake to some degree, as it was able to work on the Vizards in Turn Back the Pendulum, but we know at least that Kisuke would then later deactivate it after realizing he can't destroy it and hide it inside Rukia's Konpaku. So upon learning all of this, Aizen decides that he needs to track down Rukia, who has just gone missing in the human world, and steal the Hogyoku from her. My assumption is this scene comes after Everything But the Rain, as we are now really closing in on the main storyline if this is Aizen learning of the Hogyoku and its location. But again, that's speculation on my part. But now we reach effectively the present day. In chapter 175, End of Hypnosis 7, Truth Under My Strings, Aizen reveals to Ichigo that Hollowfication is the way for a Shinigami to break free of their boundaries, and also reveals his past exploits with experimentation. It's here he succeeds in finally stealing Kisuke's Hogyoku and will later on offer it to his own in order to finally gain a completed one. This completed Hogyoku that Aizen will soon finally have is what he believes will allow him to truly go beyond all that he has created so far. At some point between chapter 229 and 396, Aizen would fuse himself with the Hogyoku in preparation for the battle in the fake Karakura town. And in chapter 401, Deicide 3, we reach the final part of Aizen's Hollowfication experiment journey. My assumption for when Aizen says that he discovered its true nature upon becoming its master just means that Aizen realised the Hogyoku has a will and a mind of its own, as opposed to being this totally inanimate object. It is in fact sentient and alive, and will work for him. That's what I'm pretty sure he means when he says that. However, and this is where things do get a little confusing, Aizen claims to have at least known that the Hogyoku didn't have the ability that Kisuke Urahara thought it did from the very get-go. That it doesn't technically have the power to break down the barrier between Shinigami and Hollow like first thought, though it can do that. Instead, it has the ability to materialize the desires of those around it. Basically, Aizen is saying that he knew that a Hogyoku in principle wasn't capable of what Kisuke Urahara thought it was created for, that ability to break down the barrier between Shinigami and Hollow. It's just that Aizen didn't really actually know what it could do yet. And so that's why I mentioned there was an ulterior motive to those Hollowfication experiments all those years ago on that fateful night in Turn Back the Pendulum. Not only was Aizen trying to see if it was even possible to successfully hollowfy a captain-class Shinigami, he also wanted verification on his theory that the Hogyoku didn't work as Kisuke Urahara believed it did. Because Aizen says to Isshin in chapter 401 that simply by using the Hogyoku on its own, Shinji and the others should never have been able to become the perfect Vizards that they were, because a Hogyoku alone doesn't have that capability. Instead, the fact that Urahara was successful in stabilizing their minds, as we mentioned earlier, that was confirmation to Aizen of its true powers. The fact that it can indeed manifest the desires of those around it. It saved Shinji and the others not because that's what its actual power was, but because that's what Kisuke wanted in that moment. One question does remain, however. If Aizen did actually know of the true ability of the Hogyoku as far back as, say, 100 years ago, why even bother the risk of creating more Hollowfication experiments? Why even potentially put yourself in danger like that? Because of course, if he had been discovered, he would have been thrown in prison or worse immediately. So the fact that he realised surely at that point that Hollowfication wasn't the answer to transcending like he thought it was, actually it was getting a perfect Hogyoku, I wonder why even bother carrying on at all, why even bother creating White. The only thing I can think of is that Aizen is a curious, intellectual man. He's a scientist at the end of the day, and he wanted to push the boundaries of what he could personally achieve as much as possible. But anyway, with these reveals in chapter 401, Aizen finally begins to transform thanks to the Hogyoku and ascend to his desired power. Okay, yeah, so that was probably about as challenging to convey as I feared it might be, but I really hope this video was at least entertaining for you guys. I hope maybe it put it all into perspective a little bit more, outlining that timeline of Aizen's sinister Hollowfication experiments, because like I said, I think it's a really great storyline. It just feels like Kubo got a little mixed up with it along the way. It occurs across so much of the timeline. Turn Back the Pendulum, the Soul Society arc, the Urankar arc, the 1,000-Year Blood War, and in between as well, that it must have been difficult to manage. But on the whole, I think he did a pretty good job, considering what we got out of this video is so interesting, at least to me anyway. But I really hope you enjoyed the video, guys. Let me know in the comments below if I missed anything, and what you think about Aizen's Hollowfication experiments as well. What did you think of this subplot, and did it do anything for the character of Aizen for you? I'd love to know. But until next time, guys, make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, and I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.